After a long winter of 2022 into 2023, characterized by Russia paying a heavy toll to make very slow progress in the meat grinder known as Bakhmut, the weather is turning, and all speculation is that Ukraine will soon begin a spring counteroffensive, at least as soon as the mud dries up to facilitate the rapid movement of heavy machinery. The hope in Kyiv is that their plan will prove pivotal, moving away from the winter attritional phase and to a place where they can see the light at the end of the war's tunnel. With that in mind, let's discuss some possible ways that the counteroffensive could terminate the war, how plausible each is, and, as a bonus, how China might influence the proceedings. We begin with the obvious option. Ukraine just wins. It is a war, so outright beating the other side seems like a sensible solution. We have described the likely Ukrainian game plan before, but let's summarize the basics and discuss what has changed in the interim. This is the Crimean land bridge, and the odds-on first step for Ukraine is to drive a wedge in the middle of it. The last year plus has been a war of logistics, so disrupting Russia's ability to resupply will be a key goal for Ukraine. In that light, a race to Melitopol is a logical starting point for the attack. Besides having a pre-war population of almost 150,000, it is also the crossroads of two major European highways. The east-west M14, which runs to Rostov-on-Don, one of the original staging grounds for the invasion, and the north-south E105, which stretches all the way up to Moscow and then St. Petersburg. Hoping to avoid half measures, Ukraine would want to cut off Russia completely by reaching the Black Sea. Once there, the blue and yellow troops will have the ability to go after Kherson, without having to execute a dangerous river crossing along the Dnipro. Going around is the only real option that Ukraine has there, given that Russia blew the bridges during its November 2022 retreat. To further aid the siege, Ukraine may also make a second play on the Crimean Bridge, which was first attacked in October 2022, but according to Russian sources, completely reopened in February 2023. Another successful hit would limit the area to resupply via boat, effectively allowing Ukraine to quarantine the peninsula. If all of that pans out, there will be a question of what to do with Crimea afterward, but that is a much larger issue that is better reserved for another video. Heading north, Ukraine would then try to take control of the Donbas after 9 years of fighting there. Of course, that is what everyone thinks Ukraine is up to. The last time everyone thought that Ukraine was going to launch a campaign was back in September 2022, when the world was convinced that soldiers were going to pour into Kherson City. That did happen, but it was 2 months later. In the meantime, Ukraine pivoted past Kharkiv and made lightning gains in the north. Returning to the current status quo, let the speculation begin about where Ukraine could pursue an alternative. That said, any type of military route is an incredibly unlikely outcome. Ukraine's counteroffensives in September and November 2022 had a militarily brisk pace, but the total percentage of land recaptured was comparatively modest. After August 2022, Russia controlled 12.95% more of Ukraine than at the invasion's beginning. The counterattacks made a sizable dent in that, but still collectively only cut Russia's gains by a fifth. There are limits to what attacking troops can do without periods of rest and rotation, which was a main factor in concluding the September Kharkiv operation. There are also important differences between then and now. For one, Putin made this mobilization announcement of hundreds of thousands more soldiers, precisely because the Russian front lines were understaffed. Attacking the Donbas will be more difficult, because 9 years of fighting has accumulated far more in defensive fortifications than the freshly conquered territories. Meanwhile, because everyone knows that Ukraine wants to drive down Zaporizhia, Russia has been concentrating its defensive efforts in that region. Thus, a key to a successful counterattack is finding Russia's weak spot along the front line, pouring troops through there, and then pressuring from behind. Such a solution may not be easy. U.S. intelligence appears concerned that the spring offensive will generate minor gains, but not be the substantial rout that Ukraine might be hoping for. At the same time, U.S. intelligence has been wrong on this before. Remember, on the eve of the invasion, military advisors were trying to tell Ukraine how to win an insurgency, not a traditional war. More recently, the United States urged Ukraine to withdraw from Bakhmut. But Ukraine stayed, Bakhmut still held, and Ukraine continued to enjoy a favorable casualty ratio, though not as good as at the start of Russia's offensive. Perhaps the biggest barrier to an outright Ukrainian victory is that Russia is still an enormous country, and a large potential army remains untapped. If things start going south for Russia, Putin could initiate another mobilization to stem the bleeding, as he did in September 2022. It appears Russia is taking preliminary steps to facilitate that. On April 13th, Russia's parliament approved a measure that allows for a digital draft. Before, for a Russian to be conscripted, draft authorities would have to physically locate the would-be soldier and serve him papers. This created a bizarre cat-and-mouse game, where those anticipating notices would flee to their vacation homes, or stay with distant relatives, in hopes that they would not be found. This bill ends that system. Now, with just a few keystrokes, those conscripted must report for duty. Loophole closed. Given the seemingly unlimited supply of soldiers, if you want to physically stop your opponent from continuing to conscript, the traditional solution is to invade their capital. Just be careful when doing so not to be wearing 2 wristwatches, or at least a compass that looks like a wristwatch. Such a visual suggests that you looted one, which, at the time, was an offense punishable by death. Anyway, unless Zelensky plans on marching on Moscow, then the key for Kyiv to end the war is not really about a complete military defeat of Russia. A slightly different version of this story is more plausible, namely that a significant battlefield setback causes political problems back in Moscow. There is precedent for this. All you have to do is go back to World War I and the Russian Revolution. The last round of mobilization recruited the soldiers that the Kremlin wanted, but it raised social discontent and dipped Putin's approval. A second round of mobilization would likely have a bigger impact, and kill whatever remains of the special military operation narrative. Even so, that is still a long way from leading to a coup or a popular uprising, and that is assuming that a moderate, not a hardliner, replaces Putin. In any case, all of this focus on a collapse is a little strange. After all, military dominance is not the only way to terminate things. Proving one's ability more generally can also. If there is one thing you should take away from this channel, it is that the large majority of conflicts do not end like World War II, with one side's complete military collapse. War is an inefficient means of conflict resolution, because of all of the death and destruction that comes with it. States commonly look for ways out of conflicts, both before one starts and in the middle of one. And as I have stressed in video after video, if you want to understand why a war could stop, you first need to understand what caused the parties to pursue the lethal form of conflict resolution, instead of something a little less deadly. A recurring problem in this war appears to be a disagreement in its expected outcome. This dates back to Moscow's optimistic assessments about invading Kyiv, but then continued on to questions about Ukraine's initial ability to counterattack, then Russia's ability to make something happen during the winter, and now back to whether the aforementioned fortifications will hold for Russia post-winter. This creates a classic bargaining problem. If Russia thinks the expected outcome of war looks like this, but Ukraine thinks the expected outcome looks like this, then it is going to be difficult to find a resolution that serves both parties better than what each thinks it can get by simply continuing to fight. From this perspective, a sweeping Ukrainian counteroffensive is not necessary to end the war. Rather, it is about convincing Moscow that Kyiv's perception about the war's outcome is the correct one. Thus, the recipe to end the war with the spring counteroffensive is as follows. 1. Ukraine is right. 2. This is demonstrated on the battlefield. 3. Russia recognizes this. And perhaps 4. There is nothing else that Russia secretly thinks will override Ukraine's dominance afterward. That last bit always seems to be the tricky part. And yet that still seems to be lighter reading than the real book on his desk. In any case, the first 2 points are the bigger assumptions, given US intelligence's apparent caution on point 1. On point 2, it is possible that Ukraine believes that its true strength is best exerted at some future time. In other words, there is no guarantee that Ukraine views the spring counteroffensive as a culmination and not as a stepping stone for later. Thus, a semi-voluntary Russian withdrawal is also an unlikely outcome, though more plausible than an outright Russian rout. Regarding points 3 and 4, there is a shortcut that could facilitate progress: China's role as a potential mediator. This would be the second major deal Beijing has sponsored this year, after it broke down the diplomatic wall between Saudi Arabia and Iran. As for how that kind of process works, there is a common perception that mediators host the two parties, facilitate by acting as a go-between, maybe throw in a chess match or two in the case of the Camp David Accords, and then somehow magically allow the parties to reach a settlement. This theory falls flat because parties can exchange proposals on their own if they really want to, and whatever incentive they have to lie to each other also exists if the mediator acts as a go-between. Nevertheless, mediators can have an effect on the informational environment. At the start of the war, there was a clear gap between Putin's perception of his own military's readiness and what lower-level officers knew. Presumably, that gap has closed to some degree. But there may be other things that are evident to outside intelligence organizations, but that are still not filtering up to Putin. If so, China could prove useful through something known as information provision mediation. That is a fancy way to describe a mediator telling someone something that the latter did not know, to resolve information problems like the one that we described earlier. Not every country can do this. China has 2 features that combined make it unique. First, its intelligence arms are large enough that it plausibly knows something that Putin does not know. Second, China's bias toward Russia makes its guidance trustworthy. The United States, in contrast, cannot credibly assure Putin that it is a bad idea for Russia to continue the war, precisely because America's preferred outcome is that Russia leaves. China, on the other hand, does not want to see Russia waste military resources in an effort that will not harm the long-term Western position. This gives Putin a reason to heed Chinese advice, whereas he would completely ignore the same recommendations from the United States. It is also why Russia has meaningful conversations with Chinese military officials. Along those lines, China's new Minister of Defense traveled to Moscow in mid-April. We likely won't know what exactly happened in their closed-door meetings for a while, but intelligence sharing is a common activity on such trips. Or he was just there to introduce himself after his predecessor left the post last month. or they are setting up lethal aid transfers, thereby throwing all of the logic of the last video out the window. Isn't war analysis fun? Of course, all of this presupposes that China actually has information that Ukraine's belief is the correct one. If China instead agrees with Russia's belief, then she would only encourage Russia to continue, and there won't be any progress toward the end of the war. Our discussion thus far has also presupposed that diverging beliefs is the root of the problem that causes the war to continue. However, that is not the only issue that we have discussed before. With that in mind, let's pivot to how the spring counteroffensive interacts with Putin's potential personal benefits. The idea here is that Putin directly gains from winning the war in a way that the rest of Russia does not. A simple way to think of this is if winning would bring personal glory to Putin and elevate him to a status equal to Peter the Great in a way that some sort of halfway settlement would not. But at this point, perhaps the more likely interpretation is that an endgame that solidifies the status quo would result in a high likelihood of Putin's dismissal. If Russia continues the war, though, and Putin gets lucky, then the outcome might look something like this, and be more palatable to Putin's domestic constituents. If I had to place a bet somewhere, I would wager that this is the most likely reason why the war is continuing, though I do not have great confidence in that assessment. Some Russians closer to the action have called for a switch in strategies, for Russia to walk away from costly offensives like Bakhmut, and instead focus on holding the Russian gains made thus far. Putin is not doing this, and instead seeking greater glory, which raises questions about how confident he is about his ability to survive in office. But to reinforce my earlier point, the open source intelligence about any of this is bad, so our own confidence in that assessment should still be low. In any case, this would represent a major problem for terminating the war. Imagine that everyone agrees that the expected outcome of the war is indeed this. When thinking about pure interstate coercion, costs encourage early war termination. As a hypothetical, let the space between the yellow and white lines represent Ukraine's costs in terms of square kilometers, and the space between the red and white lines represent Russia's costs. The area between the red and yellow lines are what mutually beat the war outcome. However, a potential Putin personal profit prevents this path to peace. It basically undoes the cost incentive, pushing Putin's minimum past Ukraine's maximum. But if those personal benefits are indeed tied to winning, then moving the expected outcome of the war in Ukraine's favor eliminates that hope for personal gain. This can reinstate the possibility that Putin would accept a return to at least the January 2022 borders. In turn, that means a moderately successful spring counterattack that simply sets up Ukraine for another sequence later might be good enough to end it outright. Of course, this assumes that Putin can thread the needle and stand a decent chance of staying in power despite falling flat in the war. Otherwise, he'd want to keep gambling. That became much harder after he signed legislation to officially annex parts of Ukraine by Russian law, and the September 2022 mobilization. Combined, these made it his war, so to speak. How exactly Putin might thread that needle is a complicated subject, likely fit for its own future video. And getting a clear picture is difficult when you do not have Putin's bird's-eye view of Russian politics. Nevertheless, the short version of the likely scenario is that Putin would attempt to blame corrupt advisors for steering Russia in the wrong direction. Consistent with existing rhetoric, he would then frame himself as the solution to drain Moscow's swampland. Again, this pathway is more plausible than outright Russian defeat, but due to Putin's survival problem, I would rank it as less likely than an information-based resolution to the war. To clarify that potentially confusing point, I think personal benefits are still the more likely explanation for war, but conditional on being wrong, I think it is comparatively easier to resolve the information problem. There is another way China could mediate if personal benefits are responsible for the war's continuation. Let's go back to the Camp David Accords. Jimmy Carter usually gets credit for running between rooms, but the real action in Camp David was to create a large pool of aid. Carter basically threw money and military assistance at the problem. This type of mediation is known as peace subsidies. It works like its name suggests. A third party offers goodies if and only if the states stop fighting. Basically, they provide an off-ramp, like those discussed in Western circles at the beginning of the war, except now we were talking about China because the West cannot credibly promise nice things to Putin in the long run. In theory, subsidies could go to both parties. With China, though, we're probably looking at just subsidies to Russia. Because the cost spaces represent opportunity costs, and fighting means foregoing the peace subsidy, such mediation pushes back Russia's minimum demands. Going back to the earlier discussion, this is useful if Ukraine and Russia's different expectations is currently driving the conflict. But it also works for the private benefits problem. For this case, to get the red line to move in a useful direction, China would have to offer subsidies intended to counteract whatever domestic survival issues Putin faces. Like before, it is difficult to say what such aid would look like, because it first requires understanding the specifics behind Putin's domestic challengers. At the end of the day, though, it likely comes down to the thing everyone really cares about: the money. Among political elites, more cash coming in allows for direct payments and grift to make initiating a coup unattractive. For the broader population, that means rebuilding the Russian economy, keeping Russian manufacturing afloat, and ensuring that the government has enough money to keep the pension system working. On that last bit, the most recent time Putin tried to mess with pensions was in 2018, proposing older retirement ages to prop up the system. Let's just say it did not go well. With would-be soldiers unhappy right now, today would be a worse time to lose support from workers and retirees. But entering spring, China is not ready to provide the necessary relief. Unlike information provision, there is a direct cost to Beijing providing peace subsidies, namely whatever monetary benefits are going from China to Russia. For now, China seems interested in doing the exact opposite. Xi's early April 2023 trip to Moscow failed to yield any military assistance, at least officially, but he was more than happy to take advantage of Russia's weak bargaining position. Putin needed an economic outlet to combat Western sanctions. Beijing was all too happy to help, but the agreements purposely allowed the gains from trade to disproportionately flow to China. In contrast, peace subsidies would force Beijing to flip-flop the flows. Given the current status quo military position, Xi does not seem interested in doing so. Once again, though, a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive could change that calculus. China might begin believing that further fighting to serve Putin's aspirational goals will come at a high price, namely, handcuffing its alliance partners' military for years to come. At that point, Beijing may prefer taking an economic loss to ensure some long-term strategic stability. In sum, Ukraine is unlikely to outright win the war with a successful counterattack. But that is not necessary to end the war. Instead, a convincing victory could align the political incentives for Russia to call it quits. Before concluding, it is worth briefly discussing whether the war would end with a failed Ukrainian counteroffensive. That seems even less likely than the other possibilities. The winter has shown that Russia is still interested in offensive operations, even if they have not amounted to much. If Ukraine cannot make progress, Russia would appear to want to try again to see if Ukrainian exhaustion has changed anything. If you want to know more about the invasion, you will love my book that investigates its many possible causes. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe and I will see you next time. Take care. You've heard of lines on maps. Now get ready for lines on pants from the NATO 2022 Family Portrait. And you can't say I did not warn you. Let's kick things off with Jens Stoltenberg. He's okay here, but I expect better from the Secretary General of NATO. Moving on to Edi Rama, Prime Minister of Albania. 3.6 out of 10. Not great, not terrible. Bold touch with the red shoelaces, by the way. Zuzana Kapotova. The president of Slovakia demonstrated her political savvy by sitting this one out. Joe Biden. Now that's leadership right there. Pedro Sanchez, El Presidente de España. His title is the most excellent, and he is living up to that today. Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. His title is the comparatively less impressive His Excellency. That may apply to his left leg, but I find his right leg disappointing. Recep Erdogan. He may be sinking in the polls for Turkey's prime minister, but those lines are holding. Rumen Radev, president of Bulgaria. Well done, no complaints here. Robert Golob, prime minister of Slovenia. It's not bad, but his business background had me expecting more from him. Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom. I have no idea what he's doing here. Never change, Boris, never change. But our winner is Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada. Last week, Putin was keeping an eye on him. And personally, I can't blame Putin. Trudeau's lines are crisp.